Hi y'all, welcome to my shop. Today we're going to look at turning finials. Finials can be very nice projects because they fit in with projects dealing anything from furniture, bedposts, clocks, what have you, or to ornaments on Christmas tree ornaments or tops of vessels, from cremation urns to pet urns or just hollow forms. Now, turning finials can increase your effectiveness at taking smooth, fine cuts, and they can also help you improve your design technique. I'm passionate about wood turning, and I want to share with you tips, tricks, techniques, and projects with you to help you become a better wood turner. So if that's what you're interested in and you're not a subscriber, click on the subscribe button and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any future videos. So what's a finial? Well, finial comes from fini, Latin, which means the end. It's an element marking the top or end of some object, often formed to be a decorative feature. Okay, let's talk about what kind of wood you want on finials. Generally, you want the wood to be dense. You want it to be ring porous. Think Bradford pear or ebony. All right, you can see you don't want a wood with a really fancy pattern or figure such as Bacote. You see this Army combat uniform jacket I'm wearing? So, just like this pattern, this very elaborate pattern breaks up the image a little bit so it's harder to see the outline. When you have a very complex piece of wood such as Bacote, so if you try to make a finial out of a very complex pattern wood such as this, whatever this is for this pillbox, or the top of this threaded acorn box made out of Bacote, you aren't able to see the details on the finial as well. That's why you want a very plain, ordinary looking piece of wood. You don't want the pith running through the wood because that will weaken be distracting as well as weaken the piece and possibly cause cracking. Piece of wood because it gives a lot of mass rather than just a piece of wood the size of the finial, depending on how large it is and how large it's extending off. Some of my favorite wood for finials is Bradford pear. Dogwood works very well. Hard maple, if you can get it. Down here in the South we have soft maple, and that doesn't work real well for it. And for very fancy finials, for ornaments, ebony can be very nice, or African blackwood, but it can be very pricey as well. Smooth, straight grain like this holly is going to be much easier to cut and be a much stronger finial as opposed to this piece of dogwood with the grain is curved, as well as it having features in it such as a branch knot and extreme changes in shape. It's just more likely to break as you get down into some smaller details. So where are finials used? Well, let's look at some examples. A good place to start might be furniture, which includes bedposts, curtain rod ends, clock finials, even the finial on the top of a lamp that I turned, where the finial kind of mimics the actual lamp bottom. Also used in various vessels, such as a cremation urn is shown here, or a typical hollow form with a more decorative finial. And certainly boxes, such as these ring boxes, or this art box, or this other box with a little more elaborate finial. Then there's Christmas ornaments like this solid globe ornament, or this birdhouse ornament with a finial, or the more traditional hollow globe ornaments with very elaborate finials as shown here. Let's look at some of the basic tools that I tend to use for finial turning, as well as other simple spindle projects. First of all, I use a spindle roughing gouge for bulk removal of wood and turning a square to round. Some folks prefer a bowl gouge. Spindle gouges are pretty much an essential tool. I typically tend to use a 3/8 inch spindle gouge for most of my work. It's grounded about 40 degrees. Then I have a shallower fluted detail gouge that tends to be a little pointier and a little more like a 35-degree bevel with the heel ground away on both of these. Then I also have a smaller one similar to this detail gouge, but a 1/4 inch, whereas this is a 3/8 inch for a really fine detail. If I really need to get into a deep area, sometimes I'll resort to a small round skew like this. A skew works out cutting deep V grooves as well as planing cuts and some other details. And then of course my workhorse beating and parting tool. This is an 8mm, which is ground at the same angle as this, 40 degrees included angle. So I can use this for small V grooves and some light work to substitute for a skew. And of course I always use this for making tenons. Let's look at some of these concepts a little more closely as we look at a relatively simple finial project I did in the past, where a friend of mine was sent me a picture of a clock that was missing a finial and asked me if I could turn a replacement finial. And of course I said yes. So I began to do a little research. I looked on Pinterest.com at a number of different clocks and came up with a few ideas, and then I sketched them out, and then I picked the one on the left as the concept I decided to go with. Let's look at what Cindy Drozda has to say. She says, precise spindle work requires intense energy. There's little room for error, and the tiniest cut makes a huge difference in the finished piece. Planning the piece is critical. Finial turning is not one of those projects where I want to let the wood decide what the finished piece will look like. In this particular project, I actually turned a sample similar to the samples when I turned samples of boxes when I was trying to get an idea of the design, including the finial knob on the top of the boxes as shown here. Enough talking, let's get to turning. First we turn it around between centers and then we put it in a chuck. And we're going to put this and mark it off. Got to leave room to part. Okay, working from the tailstock back to the headstock, we start doing bulk removal. I'm using a beating and parting tool to just take down a lot of the wood close to the end. Then I switch to a parting tool to mark some features. Then I switch to a 3/8 inch spindle gouge to start really working on refining the details. And I measure a couple of places with calipers to be able to get the dimensions right, since I'm copying one and I don't have a storyboard, but you still got to measure sometimes. So I'm just setting the dimensions, holding it in one hand and using a parting tool on the other. As I get close, then I actually do it. Now I'm using a spindle roughing gouge to remove a lot of wood closer to the headstock. Here I'm refining the cut closer to the very top where I've got an acorn. You can see I'm still leaving the tailstock support for as long as possible. This is poplar, not necessarily the best wood for finials, but it's going to be colored. And then I add a little texturing to the acorn at the top. Probably took a little too much off the bottom before I finished the top, but I didn't, I managed. I should have gone ahead and finished that acorn first before I started really removing the bulk of the wood to prevent chattering and vibration. So I removed the tailstock. Now I'm refining the very end, and I've got to be very careful that I don't pick some chatter up near the end of the tip of this finial. Sharp tools, light cuts. And now I get ready to part it off with a thin 1/16 of an inch parting tool. Now I'm reversing it to drill a hole so I can mount this on the clock. Had I thought through the project, I would have drilled that hole in the actual blank before I did it, but because of the size, I was able to actually turn it around and hold it in the chuck without damage. Let's talk about just a few principles of design. I think, as I mentioned earlier, having wood with different colors like this, probably not a good idea because it's distracting. Sometimes less is more. A simple design sometimes is better than one that's more complex. Here's a good example of a nice, relatively simple design. Here's one where, you know, the one on the right is just way too fidgety with too many elements compared to the one on the left, in my opinion. Having too many items, too many elements, can be kind of distracting. I think sometimes just a simpler design is more powerful. Deep coves add drama. Rule of thirds, this is a terrible design because this is just right about in the middle, whereas if it's shifted down like most of the other finials, but like I say, less is more. Sometimes, you know, just too many elements are just too confusing. Let's look at a relatively simple finial, the one that's on the bottom of a globe ornament. I typically make a storyboard. Makes it easier to size blanks, and then and certainly sizing the project. So I mark the key features, and then I started roughing off the end. This is a short blank, so I don't need tailstock support. I'm using a spindle roughing gouge to rapidly remove excess wood. I'm going to use a 3/8 inch beating and parting tool for some of this work. It works kind of like a little skew. It's got a fairly sharp angle. So we're just going to kind of come in here and it'll give a catch like a skew if you're not careful. You don't ride the bevel. Close enough. So we're going to come in here and make a little V groove with this. Some of this work I'm going to use a tiny little 3/8 inch bowl gouge. I've got to take some of this out, so I'm just going to use this for bulk removal. Now, using a 3/8 inch detail gouge, I'm going to spindle gouge, let me say. Just put a little bit of a tip here. So that's the orientation I'm going to be turning. If you can see that. So I'm going to, this is a little bit larger than that. I'm going to come down, so I've got that marked. I'm not going to get real fussy about some of these dimensions. I'm going to put this in my back behind here in my dust collector hood so I can see it. And now we're just going to make a big cove here from this point on down. When we get to the bottom of that cove, you know, we got to change directions because we don't want to cut uphill. Get much thinner. I want to refine this. I want this to be a little rounder. And I'm going to come in here with this small 4-inch detail gouge that allows me to go fairly deep. Mark this. So right here is where I'm going to come down and take this part right here. Put a little V cut here, and the diameter of this is going to be about 29 millimeters. Cut that V cut. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this down right here where the V cut's going to be, and we got a ways to go to get that down to 29. Go ahead and make a V-cut here. Now let's look at a simple ornament finial. This is one for birdhouse ornament. And I'm using a much smaller piece of wood and with a smaller set of chip jaws. And first thing you do is, of course, rough it between centers. Because it is smaller, doesn't have as a heavy a mass, I've got to have tailstock support initially. So I'm using my 3/8 inch spindle gouge to start refining the bottom of it. Then I use what they call the tied underhand grip. I've got my finger wrapped underneath the tool rest to give me some additional support and leverage. Some tool rests don't lend themselves to that, but for nice detail work, sometimes it's a handy technique. And I occasionally switch to the tool that I find is the easiest or the most appropriate for me to use with my style of turning and cuts. Maybe if I was a better turner, I'd get more done with fewer tools. I'm sure that would be the case, but this is a simple one in that it doesn't really have a flame. I'm going to cut kind of a little knob on the end of it to remove that tailstock damage. So if you bring up your tailstock for support, you've got to make sure you've left a 1/4 inch or so to remove that damage, so you don't have a little divot in the bottom of your finial. Although I'm not having to use it on this one because it's fairly short, but having this tied underhand grip with my index finger, I could actually use that to support the back of the spindle for taking cuts where it's very, very thin. Again, because this has got support, it's not really necessary, but it is a possibility. Again, cutting downhill. Take your time, nice smooth cuts. And you don't want short choppy cuts. You want to, once you get a cut going, you want to keep it as long as possible, because every time the tool comes off the wood, you're going to get a little tiny tool mark, a little nervous mark that you're going to have to sand away. It's a long asymmetrical curve. When I get to the bottom, I have to change directions again to cut. Always be cutting with the grain. For a spindle, that would be from large to small. And before I remove all the mass toward the headstock, I'm going to have to finish off the bottom of this and remove the live center support. Now, if I was making a hollow globe ornament, I would be making a finial similar to this, but it would be longer and a little more difficult. So this is a nice place to start with a birdhouse ornament finial. Now I switch to a 3/8 inch detail gouge, which again has about a 35-degree bevel and fairly pointed, much more pointed than my regular 3/8 inch spindle gouge, which is more of a what they might call a fingernail shape that's fairly blunt, whereas this is very sharp to get in to do nice details. Now I'm switching to a round skew to get into details as I get ready to clean off the very bottom of the little knob on this finial to remove that live center damage. I believe this is maple I'm turning on this particular project. So I sand through all the grits as I go along with each feature. Use a little abrasive paste. Now I get ready to part it off with a thin parting tool and kind of sizing it down to the dimension that I need.
And then I'm using a 1/4 inch wrench to kind of verify that size.
If you're a visitor, I'd appreciate it if you leave one comment with the one big takeaway you got out of this video. If you want to learn more about finials, I've got a few finial projects in this Christmas tree ornament playlist you can find here. Your questions and feedback are important to me, so leave them in the comments below. And remember, y'all stay safe. Come on back. You hear?